Hello, and welcome to this lecture on professional ethics and the law as part of the COMP3020 Professional Ethics in Computing module. The topic that we're going to cover this week, both in the lectures and in the workshop, is how the law affects professional ethics, what legal issues you need to be aware of, and how you can think about those, address those. Because this is a potentially fairly complicated subject, and of course, you're not studying to be a lawyer, you're studying to be a computer scientist, so you will not be expected to have the same level of knowledge, but you will still need to understand some of the basics. Because of that, I've split this lecture into three, which hopefully will make it a bit more digestible. So in this first lecture, I will talk about some of the basics, why you need to understand the law, but also some of the fundamentals of what is law, where does it come from, how does it relate to ethics. The subsequent lectures will then look at specific legislation, in particular data protection, but also intellectual property and others. So, to start out with, why would you as a computer scientist need to know anything about the law? There are many different reasons for that. One of them is that what you do as a computer scientist, if you write code, build systems, train models, whatever it might be, this has consequences. This has consequences for individuals, for groups, for societies, for organizations, and these consequences may have legal repercussions. So you need to understand what it is that's allowed and what's not allowed, and how that relates to your work as a computer scientist. Part of that is that you have to manage risks. If you work in an organization, you need to think about what risks arise to both you as an individual, but also to your organization, and how you can make sure that those risks are mitigated. The law can pose a risk for you and your organizations. If you do not comply with the law, you will leave yourself or your employer or both open to sanctions, which may take the form of fines, other types of liability, or in extreme cases, even imprisonment. So if you break the law, this has consequences, and you want to avoid negative consequences that arise from that. On a more positive note, if you are seen to be legally compliant, this is also a factor that affects how customers see you, how society sees you. So this may create trust if you are seen to be a compliant company, a company that does what it's supposed to do, or if you are seen as an individual who is above board and does what is required, that will help your clients trust you. It will help society more broadly trust you. So, and that is something that you as a professional want to ensure as part of your professional career. And then there are often unclear areas where it's not clear whether you can do something, whether it's allowed to do something, whether you should do something. This plays into this relationship between ethics and the law. In many cases, technology moves very fast. The law may have been written a while ago for other circumstances. You need to be able to understand and interpret the law as well as ethics to see where you stand, what you think you can do, what you think you should do. So what is the relationship between ethics and the law? That's an immensely complicated topic, and you could spend your life doing research on that. Here are some key distinguishing features. So law typically comes from a legislative body, so that's Parliament. In common law countries like the UK, it can come from the courts, whereas the ethics is something that is typically a societal norm. So what we think is right or wrong is something that society debates and comes to a conclusion on or not. Ethics can have other sources. It may be your personal conscience, it may be religion, or it may also be professional bodies. And we have looked at those already in some detail. So things like the BCS, the ACM, suggest what is appropriate and what are norms that you want to follow. So there are different sources for ethics and the law. The law is typically mandatory. You have to follow it, and it's very formal. It's written down. It's clear what the basis is, and you can start to interpret this. And you have mechanisms that allow for the interpretation of the law, which is what courts do, all the way up to Supreme Courts, and all the way down to a magistrate court. They are there to interpret the law and apply it to a particular circumstance. The nature of ethics is typically much less formal. It is prescriptive, or it can be prescriptive in the sense that it suggests what you should be doing, but it's typically not aligned with a specific set of sanctions. So if you are perceived to be doing something that's immoral, unethical, then people may sanction you through ceasing interaction, through not wanting to work with you anymore. But they're typically not the sort of formal sanctions that the law has, which can include fines and imprisonment and so on. Which brings us to the enforcement side. So how does law get enforced? It depends a little bit on the type of law we're looking at. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if, for example, you are looking at criminal law, then you have things like police to enforce it, to, if you infringe it, to arrest you, prosecute you, and courts to make a decision on what the exact enforcement mechanism should be. For ethical questions, the enforcement is very different. So given that we are in a professional ethics module, one would be professional sanctions. So there may be sanctions, like let's say you're an ACM member, you do something that the ACM Code of Ethics prescribes, then you may be sanctioned as an ACM member, so that you may be kicked out of the ACM or whatever else. A lot of the enforcement of ethics happens through informal mechanisms such as reputation. So you damage your reputation. There is no clear mechanism whereby that happens, but it can happen, and it is part of the way in which ethics is enforced. And the consequences of the such infringements of those two different sets of rules can differ. So the consequences for breaking the law can be things like fines, imprisonment. You may have to pay damages. So there are clearly defined consequences. Consequences for being unethical tend to be less clear. So this may, in extreme cases, lead to the loss of your job, the loss of a contract, but it's typically much less tangible. The reputational damage is difficult to quantify, but it may still be very real and have consequences for you. So where does the law come from? We are in what they would call a common law country. Common law stands for, or the common law tradition is a legal tradition where it is not just Parliament that can pass laws, but laws can also come from tradition. So these are the two first concepts you see here. So statutory law is what you would typically have in mind when you talk about the law. So this is law that was written by a legislative body, typically Parliament. So in this country, it's Parliament. And Parliament passes a particular statute, such as the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which we cover in a different lecture, or the Computer Misuse Act, which we will also cover elsewhere. So these are hard rules that you as a computer scientist need to understand and you need to follow. The second concept of law is case law. So this is law that comes from tradition which has been refined over years, in many cases over centuries, through the courts of the country. So the definition is that it's law that derives from judicial decisions, from precedent. And the way it is implemented is through interpretation of judges. And judges can use this in order to establish liability, for example. Negligence in cases, for example, related to software failure might be something where a judge would draw on tradition and say, this is where the fault lies and this is what the consequences are. So it's interesting that in a common law country, even some very well-known and well-established crimes are not defined by statute, but by common law. So in England, for example, you have no statute for murder. Murder is a common law crime, which means that if you want to look up what does the law say about murder, what is a murder, how is it defined, what are the consequences, you will not find that there is a law that ever said murder is illegal, because murder has always been illegal. So the courts have built up a tradition of adjudicating murder that never required Parliament to intervene and pass a law. Now, what's the relationship between ethics and the law? I've already talked about the differences a minute ago, and it's probably relevant to know that there are very different views on what this relationship is. So you have the natural law tradition, where the idea is that law comes from morality. So we in society know what's right and wrong, or we have a tradition of thinking about things in a way that defines what's right and wrong, and the law needs to reflect that. So that's the natural law theory, can be mixed with for example, religious theories where you say that God is the one that tells you what's right and wrong, and then the law needs to reflect what God says. So, but it's fundamentally, it's not identical, but the law needs to build on ethics. A completely different view is legal positivism, where it's held that law is only that which is formally enacted by Parliament. It is entirely indifferent to what is ethical or what's considered to be moral. The law is set by Parliament, and then typically ethics follows. So you would then say, if Parliament makes something illegal, then people will accept that and adjust their morality and their moral perceptions accordingly. So I'm not going to say much more about this, and of course this is much more nuanced than what I can say in those couple of minutes here. But you as a computer professional need to understand that there are those different positions, and you need to understand that you will have to navigate how you deal with these questions. So where the law stands, what the law tells you, and what you do does not necessarily always have to be the same thing, and you need to understand both of those and deal with the trade-offs. There are many different types of law, more than the two that I'm going to introduce you now. There's administrative law and there's constitutional law and so on. But the two types of law that you're most likely to encounter in your work as a professional are criminal law and civil law. Criminal law is law that has a focus of actions that are perceived to be against the state. Now, they don't necessarily actually have to involve the state in any strong sense. So most crimes, for example, criminal offenses, are seen as actions against the state, and the state is the one that prosecutes. So this includes things like assault, like murder. The principle here is that the state says that you have crossed a line that makes the state liable to intervene. So even though you don't kill the state and you don't assault the state, if you commit such criminal offenses, the state in the form of police, Crown Prosecution Service, and the judges will go after you. So if you are tried, for example, for an assault, it will be you against the state. There is a victim, there's an individual who has been harmed by this and who has a role to play in this, but the main crime is between you and the state. Now, this is, if you want to, or if you're involved in this sort of criminal offense, then the state has to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you were the perpetrator, which is a very high threshold. It means that there is not a lot of wiggle room. You can only be convicted if it is very certain, and what exactly beyond reasonable doubt is something that the courts interpret and decide. Examples of this, of the sort of criminal offense that you may encounter would be infringements of the Computer Misuse Act, so hacking, and again, we'll cover that in a separate lecture, or it might be fraud offenses. So these are criminal offenses where the state, in the form of the police or other law enforcement agencies, will come and prosecute those. So that's criminal law. Civil law is completely different in that it is a dispute between two parties, two individuals, two organizations, who have different views on what could be done and should be done, and the state just sits as an adjudicator. So the courts will still get involved. So if you get sued, for example, by a client, or if you sue a client, this will still end up before a judge. But the state itself is not a party to the proceedings. The state is just the impartial observer that makes a decision on what the situation is and what the outcomes are. So the burden of proof in the case of civil law is much lower. It's on the balance of probability. So you may be held liable if it's just more likely that you did something wrong than you didn't. Examples of civil law proceedings that might be relevant to computer scientists are things like breach of contract. So if you infringe a software license, negligence where you, for example, create an algorithm that causes financial loss, where your client, so you've been tasked with creating an algorithm, it's been faulty, the client has lost money because of that, they sue you or they sue your organization, and then this goes in front of a judge who decides whether you've been negligent or not, and depending on whether that's the case, they may hold you liable or not. So those are the two main bits of law that you're likely to encounter. The sanctions are different. The criminal law is where criminal sanctions come in, where things like fines and imprisonment can happen. Civil law is just about balancing competing claims, and the way it's settled is typically through payments. So if you're held to have breached your duties, then you may be required to pay compensation. You don't go to prison for anything in civil law. So where does that leave you as a computer scientist? Some people say as a professional, you always have to follow the law, and breaking the law is always wrong. It's always morally wrong, unethical in a professional context. I wouldn't go quite so far, which is why I added the almost there. I think it's safe to say that in most cases that you will encounter in practical life, following the law is what you should do. So following the law, being compliant is part of your ethical duties as a computer scientist. But, and this is the bit on the right, can you think of exceptions to this? So I don't think that's always the case, and you may want to consider where that might find its limitations. So that's a little bit of the philosophy of law. That's part of the introduction of what we've done here. In the next lecture, I will talk about intellectual property law and about cybercrime and a few other bits and bobs which are likely to be relevant to you as computer scientists. We'll then do a more detailed analysis of data protection, because data protection legislation is something that you are very likely to encounter in your professional life. And then we will use all of these insights in the workshop, where we will try to apply laws to practical scenarios, in particular to your group report. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.